Welcome everybody. Let's start right on time. We have a very rich program today. Welcome all, dear students, dear guests. This is now the fifth event of our lecture series, Topographies of Displacement and Resistance. The first lecture, if you remember, took place on March 15th. Only 3 days later, the EU-Turkey refugee agreement was consolidated right after the beginning of our lecture series. Since then, while we had here in this lecture series one interesting and insightful lecture after another about various locations of displacement and resistance in the Middle East and before the shores of the Schengen area, the situation on the Mediterranean and the Balkan routes actually drastically worsened since we started this lecture series. The criminalization of refugees intensifies with every single day. In fact, while the European media still talks about a refugee crisis, in fact, what we're witnessing is almost a war against refugees. There are NATO vessels patrolling between Turkey and Greece, and soon will do also in front of the shores of Libya. According to a recent report by Human Rights Watch, Turkish border patrols have shot and killed 3 refugees in March and April, and 1 smuggler, and injured several refugees at the Turkish-Syrian border. In Slovakia, too, we had the news about a woman being shot by the border patrol. There's not much public outrage against these shootings. It almost seems that we are all getting accustomed to the misery that the refugees are forced to endure. However, parallel to these horrific news that we're getting, acts of transnational solidarity are still taking place and help to rescue, to save lives, and help people to flee. People all over the world, from Europe and other places also, are flocking, for instance, to Greece, to the various routes, for example, to help out as volunteers, building alliances with local support groups and with the refugees. At our lecture, at our session today, we are going to learn more about the various forms of transnational solidarity practices, and we will discuss their impact. We will begin today with a lecture by Charles Heller, whom I will introduce in a minute, and then we will move over to a roundtable discussion with activists who are active in the Balkan route, as well as the Mediterranean, Adrian Homburger and Hatem Garibi, who will be introduced later also. They will be introduced by Sarah Schilliger, with whom I have organized this lecture series. Unfortunately, I should add, Professor Kenny Coopers, whom we had announced to be also one of the moderators, cannot be here today. He extends his sincere apologies. But instead of Kenny, I'm happy that I can now introduce our first speaker, Charles Heller, to you. Dr. Charles Heller has completed his PhD in architecture at Goldsmith College in London. He studied before arts and international politics in Geneva. In 2005, Charles released a video about the societal impacts of the Swiss asylum law, which was screened at the Human Rights Festival in Geneva. In 2006, he released another video, this time about transit migration in the Moroccan Sub-Sahara. In 2009, he produced a further intervention called Home Sweet Home, which is an historical analysis of the Swiss immigration system. In 2013, he produced the video Liquid Traces, the Left to Die Boat case, which is intimately related to the work he does with the Watch the Mat network, of which he is a co-founder of. I'm very happy to have him here. Let me just maybe say 2 more words about what the Watch the Mat is. Watch the Mat is an online mapping platform to monitor the deaths and violations of migrants' rights at the maritime borders of the EU. The Watch the Mat project was initiated in 2012 in the central Mediterranean and has by now developed to a large network of organizations, activists, and researchers through the transnational cooperation with migrant rights organizations and activists, migrants and seafarers who are active in and around the Mediterranean. They use new mapping technologies, of which we will hear also today about, to document what is happening on the Mediterranean. Please give a warm welcome to Charles Heller, who will talk about Ebbing and Flowing, the shifting borders and front lines of the EU's politics of migration. Thank you so much for being here, Charles.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for being here. It's great to see so many people came out tonight. Thanks a lot to the organizers for having me. And listening to Bilgin, it's true. I was thinking that I'm in fact a Swiss national, and I've grown up and studied mostly in Geneva, and my work with migrants and refugees started in Switzerland, and the first larger work and video that I did was NAA, which is something like 10 years ago now, on the effects of the recent shift in the Swiss policies back in 2004 concerning what we refer to as the Nicht-Eintretens Entscheid. And finally, if I have to think about it, since the last 10 years, maybe in Switzerland or in Morocco, or since 2011 with my colleague Lorenzo Pezzani and many other people also in this room, I've been working exclusively almost on the maritime frontiers of the EU. But finally, it's a very similar practice that is located between research, activism, and aesthetic practice, whether it's with films or with maps, etc., seeking to contest the violence of European border policies, whether it's here or at the external frontiers of the EU. So tonight, I would like to offer kind of a broad sketch of what I see as the major shifts at the frontiers of the EU over the last few years, both in terms of bordering policies, but also I will try to weave in some of the important shifts in activist practices that have emerged at the borders of the EU. And, you know, we tend to think of the sea as an empty, lawless space, which only exists somehow between states, territorial states, where the really important things happen. But I guess with my colleague Lorenzo Pezzani, since 2011, what we've been trying to do in a way is to politicize the sea, which means, on the one hand, to seek to analyze political practices at sea and understand the political geography of the sea, and in turn try to think of and contribute to political practices that take the sea as their very space of operation. And we see the sea both as a space of invention and innovation for state practices and transformations of sovereignty. We speak of a form of unbundled sovereignty that operates at sea, where rather than the rights and obligations that you would have on firm land in territorial states, where a population, a sovereign state, and rights all fit neatly within the territorial boundaries of a given state. At sea, what you have is a form of sovereignty which is unbundled, as we say, right? So where rights and obligations are, if you will, decoupled from each other and extended to different spatial degrees. This is what you maybe see a little bit here with, for example, the territorial waters in which states have full sovereignty, or the contiguous zone in which they may exercise custom functions. And crucially for our work, search and rescue areas in which coastal states are responsible to operate rescue. And so as you see from this simple map is that the sea is not at all a lawless space, but rather a space which is crisscrossed by jurisdictions that overlap and often conflict as well with each other. The sea, I think, is a space of invention for state practices, new forms of government, new arrangements between states and private actors, as we will maybe see in the presentation, but also a space of inventions, of activist practices. And I think that several of the projects that have emerged at the maritime borders of the EU over the last years have been really incredibly innovative and really inventions of new activist practices in the space of the sea. As you all know, the phenomena of illegalized migrants crossing the maritime borders of the EU and the death of migrants at sea is a long-standing phenomenon, which essentially emerges with the consolidation of the EU at the end of the 80s, and in particular, the signing and the entry in force of the Schengen Convention in 1990, really one of the first pillar of what one might call the architecture of the EU migration policies. And with this convention, essentially what emerged is a space of freedom of movement within the EU, but which was predicated on the exclusion of the access to EU territory for most of the populations of the global south, and a kind of displacement of European borders towards the external border of the EU. Now, the denial of legal access to the EU did not, of course, result in the end of the migration that was designated as undesirable. Rather, it forced these people to migrate in unauthorized and illegalized forms. And every form of control which was extended onto out onto the sea or onto the southern shores of the Mediterranean through agreements with neighboring states, in fact, never put an end to illegalized migrants' crossings, just forced them to shift routes, resort to new strategies, etc., etc. Those who have paid the price for these migration policies are, of course, migrants themselves who have paid in the currency of their very lives. We know that there are more than 20,000 documented deaths at the maritime borders of the EU over the last 25 years. The second key pillar of the European migration architecture would be the Dublin Conventions. And with these conventions, which concerned only asylum seekers and the way to allocate asylum seekers within the European space, and which established that the first country in which a person arrives, that country is responsible for processing his or her asylum request. What this convention entailed is kind of the locking in of external and internal borders, in the sense that any migrant who enters one of those, one of the coastal states like Spain, Italy, or Greece, becomes, if you will, a burden for those coastal states. Now, over the years, contrary to the images of constant boats arriving on European shores that we see, of course, in the media since a much longer time than the last 2-3 years, or during the migration crisis, in quotation marks, might suggest. In fact, over the 2000s, on average, there were roughly 50,000 people who crossed the sea each year. And so the European migration architecture somehow could hold as long as those numbers remained relatively low on the one hand, and on the other, as long as coastal states could develop policies and strategies to avoid being made responsible for providing asylum and assistance to them. One strategy was coupling interception with repatriation agreements. This was the case, for example, during 2006-2007, when there was an important number of Senegalese migrants in particular that reached the Canary Islands, right? And you can see here that this surge, if you will, in arrivals in Spain dropped dramatically the following year, and dropped entirely as of 2009. A similar strategy, slightly different, is the so-called pushback agreements, which were established between Italy and Libya in 2009. And here you see the dramatic drop in the central Mediterranean between 2008 and 2009-2010. In fact, this gives you kind of a snapshot of the migration picture in terms of crossings of the sea at the eve of the Arab uprisings. In fact, the crossings of the sea had all but stopped, although what you can't really see here is that crossings had continued between Greece and Turkey and other countries, but rather on the land route at that time. But the sea itself had been all but closed through the coupling of militarized interceptions and repatriations, or pushbacks. And the Arab uprising completely undid this regime of control over the maritime borders of the EU. On the one hand, states which had been entrusted the control of the southern frontiers, like the Ben Ali regime or the Gaddafi regime, were toppled. And migrants seized the freedom of movement, which those states had been denying them. On the other, in 2012, the European Court of Human Rights outlawed the pushback agreements between Italy and Libya. So that kind of strategy was also no longer available to states in their attempt to avoid being made responsible for migrants arriving at their shore. And while there were other cases of non-assistance before then, in 2011 we really witnessed several cases of non-assistance, as well as conflicts between coastal states as to rescue and disembarkation, right? I mean, you have to understand the dilemma in which coastal states found themselves, right? They did not want to be made responsible for migrants arriving on their shores, and the traditional means and tools that they had at their disposal were rendered obsolete by the massive geopolitical shifts that were occurring in the area. So one of the strategies that they resorted to was practices of non-assistance. And one particular emblematic case is what is now known as the left to die boat case, in which 63 people were left adrift during 14 days in the maritime surveillance zone established by NATO at the height of the intervention in Libya. So you have to imagine that these people, 63 people, 72 people, excuse me, who had embarked on this boat, were left to drift in what was simply at the time the most surveyed waters on Earth. And this despite repeated distress calls and repeated encounters with different states and non-state actors. I won't go into too much detail into this case, but this is really the case with which we started our work of the project, within the project Forensic Oceanography, of trying to account for violence done at and through the sea, in the sense that at sea it is not usually bullets of border guards who kill migrants seeking to cross borders, but the transformation of the sea through policies into a deadly liquid. And so here we, of course, recorded the testimonies of the 9 survivors of this tragedy, but also coupled the testimony of these survivors with various forms of geo-referenced data, like distress signals, like a drift model, which we reconstructed with an oceanographer, which allowed us to understand the exact trajectory of the migrant's vessel throughout its 14 days of drift. And then the next question was, well, okay, we know where that boat was. We know that all vessels in the area were informed of the distress of those passengers. Well, where were those 38 warships deployed off the Libyan coast? And so to try to answer that question, we use satellite imagery, which you see here, and the resolution of that imagery only allows us to determine that those were large ships, either commercial or military. And of course, the question that is still unanswered, or partly unanswered to this day, is whose ships were they? The report that we produced was the basis for several legal complaints against different states that were in operation during the NATO intervention. These cases against France, Italy, Belgium, Spain are still ongoing, and of course contentious strategic litigations are often very lengthy in their unfolding. With the release of our report, what we immediately tried to do was to make available the tools that we had began to forge through this investigation to the wider migrants' rights movement. And this is how, in collaboration with numerous organizations, activists, and other researchers, we created the Watch the Med online mapping platform. The platform was created in 2012 in the framework of a campaign called Boats for People at the time, and really began operating and consolidating as of summer 2013. And through this platform, we also, once again, documented new cases of non-assistance. Now, I'm sure you know very well of the 3rd of October shipwreck, less than 1 kilometer up the coast of Lampedusa, in which 366 people died. But much less well known is a second shipwreck that occurred less than 1 week after that event, in which, again, as a result of the conflict of responsibility for rescue between Italy and Malta, rescue of a boat loaded with more than 400 passengers was delayed by several hours. And by the time rescue finally arrived, more than 200 people had sank with that vessel. So we reconstructed again this case between October and November 2013. But within the Watch the Med network, several voices began to say, but how many cases of non-assistance can we document? How can we develop a practice that might prevent those cases of non-assistance from occurring at all? And this is the way, based on the example of several other people like Father Zerai, who had been operating a phone line on an individual basis for many years, we sought to create the alarm phone project, through which a phone line is made available and redirects distress calls to activists located across Europe and North Africa. And of course, Hatem will talk about this in much more detail than I will. So this project began to emerge really in winter 2013 and was launched 1 year after the 11th of October shipwrecks, i.e. October 2014. Now, in that single year, a sea change had occurred at the maritime frontiers. With the 3rd of October shipwreck, of course, some politicians, like President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, were quick to, just propose more of the standard deadly medicine, more money for Frontex, more money for Eurosur. But the Italian Navy launched the Mare Nostrum operation, which at the time was the largest search and rescue operation in Mediterranean history. Mare Nostrum was a radical break with the policy of either interception and pushback or generalized reluctance to operate rescue that we had been observing and documenting and denouncing in the previous years. With Mare Nostrum, a record number of assets were deployed very close to the Libyan coast, as you see here. And those assets proactively patrolled the Libyan coast to rescue migrants in distress. The conflicts of responsibility over rescue and disembarkation between Italy and Malta all but vanished during that time, and rescued migrants were brought by default to Italy. Now, some accused Mare Nostrum of being a pull factor. While, we certainly cannot blame anyone from hoping to be rescued and taking advantage somehow of that hope, clearly the factors that were leading to more important crossings, in fact, were rather regional and political factors, such as the intensification of the war in Syria, the increasing difficulty and saturation of the condition of Syrian refugees across the region, the toppling of the Morsi regime, which led to a crackdown on Syrian refugees as well in Egypt, and the increasing violence and chaos that engulfed Libya. Nevertheless, Mare Nostrum was accused of being a pull factor, and for this reason, European states did not support the funding of the continuation of this operation at the end of 2014. In their discourse, we could go in more detail into this, but they were coupling the claim that it was a pull factor and the claim that it was leading to more deaths at sea. Of course, once again, the issue was not so much the deaths at sea, which, let's face it, European politicians have a complete disregard for, but the number of arrivals on Italian shores, but more importantly for the rest of Europe, the movement of migrants arriving on Italian shores across European space. Of the more than 170,000 people who arrived in Italy during 2014, in fact, only 64,000 filed asylum claims in Italy. And the rest succeeded in continuing their movement across European space and filing asylum claims in the countries more or less of their choice. This, of course, led to rippling conflicts throughout European space and really a crisis both of the Dublin and the Schengen conventions. And what you see really with Mare Nostrum is that the expansion of state responsibility at sea was predicated on the retreat of state responsibility on firm land. And this expansion and simultaneous retreat really sent a crisis rippling throughout the European migration policy architecture. So at the end of 2014, Mare Nostrum was replaced by more limited Frontex-led Triton operation. Here you see the two zones compared. Not only was the operational zone of Triton, which you see here, more limited. This is, in purple is the Triton zone, in green is the Mare Nostrum zone. But the Triton operation had a third, even less than of the budget, much more limited means, and very simply, Frontex does not have the mandate to operate rescue, right? Rescue is not Frontex operational priority, which is rather, of course, border control. Now, human rights community, for once, unanimously, from critical migration rights organizations to the IOM or the UNHCR, denounced the ending of Mare Nostrum. Sorry, for some reason. Okay. Denouncing the ending of Mare Nostrum, claiming that it would not lead to less crossings, but only to more deaths. And effectively, looking at this map, which is a map of the locations of interceptions in 2014, you could ask, well, with the retreat and the ending of the Mare Nostrum operation, what would happen to all those boats which were located which were in distress in this area, which would now be left within a search and rescue gap, if you will? Well, the predictions of the human rights community proved entirely right. The number of crossings stayed practically unchanged in early 2015 in relation to 2014, but the number of deaths soared. And what happened essentially was that to fill the gap in search and rescue capability that was left by the ending of Mare Nostrum, the Italian Coast Guard increasingly relied on merchant ships to operate rescue. These merchant ships had denounced, so merchant ships became the number one search and rescue actor in the first 5 months of 2015. And the merchant shipping community had warned several times that the burden that they were being made to carry was beyond their capacity to carry it, and that they were unfit to carry such difficult search and rescue operations. And nobody listened to those warnings, to those calls, to the signs that unfolded in the first months of 2015. And effectively, between the 12th and the 18th of April 2015, 2 shipwrecks occurred, one after the other, in which 400 and then 800 people died, i.e. 1,200 people in 1 week, in cases of shipwrecks that occurred at the very moment when those boats were almost being rescued by large commercial ships. And in our recent report, we argue that these cases of death by rescue were the predictable and predicted outcome of the EU's policy of non-assistance. So in a sense, in our practice, we've kind of moved here from a work that documents cases of direct non-assistance, like in the Left to Die boat case, to trying to develop a kind of forensics of policy that looks at the EU's policies of non-assistance. Now, this is the mortality rate, which increased exponentially over the first months of 2015 in relation to the first months of 2014. Now, like the October shipwrecks, the October 2013 shipwrecks, the April 2015 shipwrecks led to dramatic changes once again at the maritime frontiers of the EU. A first dramatic and impressive change was the deployment of what quickly became a non-governmental flotilla deployed specifically to operate rescue, where states had retreated and failing in their responsibility. So MSF in particular deployed 3 vessels. There was also another vessel launched 1 year before, in fact, by the MOAS, as well as a small German initiative called Sea Watch. And this non-governmental practice proved extremely impressive and did an amazing work over 2015. And by the end of October 2015, together they had rescued more than 18,000 people. However, states too redeployed their operations at sea. However, this time, essentially stripping the humanitarian mission that had been at the core of Mare Nostrum and reducing their operations to their security dimension. Now, first, on the 29th of April, Jean-Claude Juncker, then president of the European Commission, admitted after the April shipwrecks, listen, ending Mare Nostrum was a serious mistake. It cost more lives. So, you would think, well, we made a mistake. Someone's going to lose their job, right? No. Frontex budget was tripled, right? So, this is kind of the too big to fail syndrome, right? And so, on the one hand, the Frontex operation was expanded, its budget was tripled, but it still did not have the mandate and the core mission of operating rescue. And on the other hand, another operation, military operation, UNAVFOR Med, now Operation Sophia, was deployed to combat smuggling networks operating off the coast of Libya. Again, this operation did not at all have rescue as its priority, and by the end of the year, when it had been launched in June 2015, barely a month after the MSF operations, the UNAVFOR Med operation had rescued 8,000 people, while together, by the end of 2015, the non-governmental flotilla had rescued more than 20,000 people. So, those numbers in themselves show you that, with much more important means, they were rescuing much fewer people, and that clearly, rescue was not their operational priority. So what emerged during 2015 was a kind of paradoxical situation, if you will, when the twin mission of Mare Nostrum, humanitarian and security, were kind of decoupled from each other. And rescue was being operated mainly by non-governmental flotilla, and the security dimension was being operated by Frontex and UNAVFOR Med. And in fact, this photograph is kind of exemplifies the paradoxical situation this led to, because this photograph is taken from on board an MSF vessel shortly after they rescued a boat in distress, and now the passengers on board that boat are on board the MSF vessel, and what you see in the distance is the boat that they had been on being blown to ashes by the UNAVFOR Med operation. So despite themselves, non-governmental actors had entered a kind of strange and a bit ambivalent relation of complementarity here with states' policies of militarization and control. Now, of course, the second question was, how would states avoid or seek to avoid the crisis of Schengen and Dublin that had been the product of the expansion of state sovereignty at sea during the Mare Nostrum operation? Well, since the issue had been the unwillingness or incapacity of the Italian authorities to fingerprint and register migrants arriving on their shore, this phase of re-expansion of state sovereignty at sea was coupled with a policy specifically designed at strengthening control on migrants upon their arrival, but you might say even more, on strengthening control on coastal states to implement that control in turn. So this was really, the core tool at the heart of this policy has been the hotspots, right, which have been opened in Italy and in Greece, and essentially in which Italian and Greek authority are being disciplined by Northern European states and European agencies and forced to re-implement fingerprinting and control for migrants arrived on their shore. Of course, you all know that so far that reinstating of control at the southern rim of the EU and what we have called a process of internal externalization, right? So I think we need to think of European policies as operating successive rims of border control, right? So you would have external externalization in non-European neighboring states, control at sea, but now with the hotspots approach, a form of internal externalization which seeks to inscribe a new rim of border control at the southern border of the EU, but on the inside of the EU this time, right? So of course this attempt to reinstate control has not been successful to date, and you of course know that the whole European migration policy continues to be in a state of crisis, and if there is a crisis, it's at the level of EU policies, not in terms of the numbers of migrants that are arriving on European shores. And during the summer of 2015, we saw what was very simply, the most amazing cycle of migrant struggles in recent history, with forms of civil disobedience enacted on really an unprecedented scale, which in the perspective of history, one day certainly will be seen in the same light that we think of the Montgomery March led by Martin Luther King, or the Salt March led by Mahatma Gandhi. And here again, activist practices supporting this unauthorized movement across borders have been crucial, whether in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of information, like through the Welcome to Europe or Moving Europe networks, or through forms of direct logistical support, like support to their movements through civilian car sharing, etc., etc. Right? Now, in addition to the re-expansion of control at sea and the attempt to reinstate control on the inner rim of European territory, of course you know that the EU has been attempting desperately to reinstate control on its external periphery. While this has been impossible to date in Libya, this is what the EU is struggling still to implement with Turkey, and the agreement that was struck in March 2016, which Bilgin evoked briefly. Well, this is kind of my broad tour of the shifts that I see as having been key at the maritime borders of the EU. I've tried as well to show how evolutions at sea are intimately tied to shifts in policy as well on firm land. My prospects for 2016 extremely open. We're not at all seeing, as of yet, very defined tendencies or shifts in migration routes. I mean, the simple history of the last 25 years, demonstrates very simply and clearly that every time states have sought to block one route, migrants have shifted their strategies and routes towards another, right? So, and usually this has led to more danger for migrants at sea. And actually, my last point would be that, well, what does this mean as well for activist practices? I have no doubt that, as we have seen over the last years, activists will reinvent novel ways to support migrants, defend their rights, support their unauthorized movements, whatever shifts may occur. But one thing that we should keep in mind, both in considering the possible shift from the Aegean towards the central Mediterranean once again, but also in concerning what we ourselves can do to support them. In fact, the only actor who has made the crossing of the sea as a whole much less dangerous in 2015 than in all preceding years since the beginning of 2000 have actually been migrants themselves. Because through the collective choice of mainly Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, etc., to cross en masse through the Aegean instead of the central Mediterranean, they crossed through a route which is, since several years, much less dangerous than is the central Mediterranean, right? It's much shorter. The smuggler networks are organized in a very different and often more self-organized way than the extremely structured and criminal and violent networks operating in Libya. And so maybe this is just a final note, both in terms of the prospects for 2015. If there is a shift from the Aegean to another route, we can expect that this will cost many more lives. And secondly, in thinking of how we can support migrants in many different ways, which I've tried to hint at, let's always bear in mind as well the form of support that they enact themselves through their own migration and organized networks. So I'll leave it at this, and I look forward to the conversation.